Good morning, everyone. The Victoria Arts Council respectfully acknowledges the Lekwungen-speaking people within whose traditional territory we operate, as well as the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic First Nations, whose historical relationships with this land and diverse art forms continue to this day. We raise our hands in gratitude for the hereditary leaders, the matriarchs, and of course the artists from these lands, and we give thanks for the privilege of living and working here. My name is Keegan McFadden, and I'm the Executive Director of the Victoria Arts Council, as well as the co-lead with Creative Mornings Victoria. And we have a very exciting, seems like we're speaking into a void, but a very exciting morning this morning. We're here at Pacific Opera, live on location, and we have Isaiah Bell and Sean Guist, who's going to be speaking about their collaborative work, The Book of My Shames. So I'll just let Cass give the sponsor acknowledgements, and then I'll be right back.
All right, so welcome to Creative Mornings. All right, so May's theme is acceptance. Acceptance is weaving into your story what once caused you pain, and still might to this day. You welcome the creature into your home, tend to its wounds, and feed it out of your hand. Acceptance is knowing that this feral animal lives side by side with your tender house cat of a heart, always. Our Lexington chapter shows this month's exploration of acceptance, and Robert Beatty illustrated the theme. Thank you to MailChimp, Creative Mornings' official global partner for marketing. If anyone is considering a career shift, our partners at MailChimp have some inspiration for you. This month, MailChimp is presenting Second Act, a show which follows 5 people who shifted careers in pursuit of their passions. You can visit the Creative Mornings website for more information. So the #1 way that people learn about Creative Mornings is through their friends. So this month we invite you to bring a friend, whether they've never heard of Creative Mornings or need a reminder to come back. So please get them to tag along. Thank you to the City of Victoria and their CRD for their continued support. And thank you to HCMA. HCMA is an architecture firm that designs buildings, brands, and shared experiences that connect people. So we're from the Victoria Arts Council, and we'd like to share our current exhibition, Avis Rasmussen, The View from Here. In this retrospective exhibition spanning 6 decades of production, the VAC recognizes the astounding output by the local artists. Please join us this Sunday for our curator's tour with Kagan at 3 p.m. to close the show. In addition to here, we have a number of community satellite galleries around town, including the Victoria International Airport and 5 Greater Victoria public libraries. So please visit our website for more details on each satellite show. We currently have out a call for participants for the Reclaim Public Art Residency. So if you're interested in gaining experience, professional skills, and networks needed to expand your public art practice, this may be for you. So please visit our website for more information. The deadline is June 19th. All right, pass it back over to Keegan.
Thanks, Cass. Okay. Isaiah Bell and Sean Guist, co-creators of the open-hearted opera cabaret theater solo show, The Book of My Shames, talks about the transformative power of accepting our pasts, ourselves, and the world around us. The collaborators discuss the merging and divergent artistic approaches as a metaphor for dynamic, creative acceptance, and dive into the sharing of vulnerability as a life practice. In a product-oriented society, accepting may suggest meekness, submission, defeat, failure. But does true acceptance mean giving up on positive change or betraying ambition? Is letting go the same as giving up? Isaiah Bell performs across North America as a tenor and complements that practice with composing and writing. He combines all 3 disciplines in his solo chamber opera cabaret theater show. There's a lot of hyphens in there. The Book of My Shames, a co-creation with director Sean Guist around Isaiah's words and music. The piece, which has been described as impossibly beautiful and a comic, wrenchingly personal tour de force, has been presented by opera companies and orchestras across Canada and continues to tour. Sean Guist is an arts administrator by day and a queer artist, producer, and director by night, though these lines are blurring on Lekwungen territory. Sean is a founding curator of Intrepid Theatre's Outstages Queer Theatre Festival and serves as artistic director at Intrepid Theatre, where he has created new residency programs for local artists and fostered new work through cabarets, emerging arts programs, and mentorship opportunities. His alter ego, the bearded drag queen Woofy, has performed on stages across the city, as well as in parking lots, breweries, and on Zoom. He is passionate about bringing queer art and queer events to new spaces and places. So please welcome Sean and Isaiah.
I'm gonna quickly see if I can change this.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, Good Morning Victoria Art Sounds for having us. We have 20 minutes to talk about acceptance and how that weaves through or is centered in our show.
Yeah, it's interesting that this is happening right now because we just got finished 2 weeks of really intense time banging the show out in 2 different cities. And so every time we do this, well, I guess I should just say just a minute about what this show is so that we have a bit of context for what we're talking about. Kagan gave an introduction about the sort of all the hyphens that refer to it, but what it basically is a sort of semi-autobiographical piece of theater that sort of uses my personal, well, it's called the Book of My Shames, but uses my personal sort of awkwardness of life to explore what it means to sort of go through life with a feeling of not being enough or of having a sort of, well, we call it the story of a hole in the show. It's a sort of hole in you that never changes on the inside, no matter what happens on the outside of you, no matter how you grow as a person. And so every time we do the show, there's always a sense of really a very living engagement with that living thing that the show is about, even though maybe we wrote the words years ago. Every time we do the show, there's a sense with the people that are there in the space that something alive is happening and that we're really actually re-engaging with that very living thing that the show's about. So just having come off that last week, we have a lot of ideas about this idea about acceptance.
I thought that we would, queer the form of this presentation a bit too, and that I would maybe just start by not just being a presenter, but also a facilitator and ask you some questions as well. And then we'll jump back and forth. I'm sure we'll just pose questions to each other a bit too. But there's a part of the show, a monologue where you talk about your experience growing up as a child on I believe what you call an apocalyptic wilderness cult.
That's right, yeah.
And what that experience was like and what you went through as a child, but also as a baby gay in this setting. And I wanted to ask, this show deals a lot with your own difficult past and your own personal traumas. And acceptance is a big part of that, I think, for the show. And I wanted to ask, how did you become okay with writing a show that was about that?
Well, in a Q&A after a show a couple weeks ago, someone asked, how do you protect your heart when you're sort of trotting out this sort of these traumas and this discomfort, time after time in front of strange audiences and sort of as a professional practice? And I hadn't realized until this person asked that, until I heard myself answering what the answer was, which is that it's harder on my heart to not sort of share what happened to me and what happened and what my life is like. I feel like that's my sort of setting as a person. Like this body wants to sort of share what this experience is. And I think a lot of artists have that experience of feeling like their purpose is to experience life. A lot of artists are very sensitive bodies and sensitive beings, and the way that they make meaning out of that is by experiencing life and then letting that sort of pass through them and on to other people. I often feel like that's my sort of calling is to be like a prism for life experience for people who don't have the room in their life to really understand what happens in their experience. And sometimes, I experience this all the time where, on Instagram, you see someone post a quote about something that you had never named that thing in your life before, even though you've experienced it many times. And someone had to take the time, some poet or just, civilian had to take that time to actually name that thing. And then once you see it, then that helps you understand your life a little more clearly. And so that's I know that's kind of a roundabout answer to your question, but I had a feeling when this person asked that question of how do you sort of come to terms with, how do you do that? I feel like for me, it's harder growing up in a fundamentalist apocalyptic commune as I did. The setting is to keep things down, is to keep things in and to keep things strict and to hide yourself. And for me, that's hard on my heart. So the process of my life and of being an artist has been surrounding myself with enough love and support and care that I can be the person that I am, which is the person that wants to explode all my feelings and experiences out there.
Well, and I think part of what you have to do with this show too is be okay enough with yourself to share it, because you have to tell this story night after night.
Yeah, but the thing is that I'm never gonna be okay with myself. Like that's kind of the point of the show, is that we talk about, no matter, in fact, sometimes the better it seems on the outside, the more confusing it seems that the inside hasn't changed. And that's kind of where the show came from, is that my idea of how people would see the stories that I have to tell was so different once I started telling them from the way that they actually did seem to see them, that I realized that there was this enormous gap between the sort of outer part of me and the inner part that hasn't changed. So yeah, so I mean, part of the process is being okay with not being okay with yourself.
That's part of what the show is about.
Yeah.
But what's it like for you in terms of acceptance of having people that you know that didn't know this part about you come to the show?
That's a huge thing, actually, and this is kind of the center of what this most recent experience has been, because we've taken the show all over. But this is the 2 weeks ago was the first time we did it in the hometown, and I've had experiences before with a hometown crowd where I came with a very prepared show, a classical music piece, and thought, oh, this is going to be a friendly hometown crowd. And then as soon as I walked out in front of all these people I knew, my body froze up, because my sort of projecting brain of imagining what all these people I know were thinking about me sort of kicked into overdrive. And my body froze, thinking like, oh, there's all these people seeing me in all these different ways that I can't control, that know me and think, oh, whatever opinion that I was projecting on these people. But this was not the experience this time. In fact, it was strangely the opposite. I mean, we were doing it at Pacific Opera, which is the space that we're in right now. And there was such a sense of, I talked about this a lot in the Q&As and just with the colleagues, there was such a sense that the people in the room weren't assessing me. I guess because they already knew me. This is something that as a touring musician, you don't get a chance to really experience that much, because you're always trying to impress new people. And I think that you sometimes take your non-acceptance of yourself into every space that you have. And because you don't know the people and they don't know you, you can always convince yourself that they're there to sort of assess you and judge you and determine moment to moment whether you're good enough to be with them. And when I was actually with these people who actually know me, and we've been working on building this program together in the hometown environment, I was amazed and surprised to realize that that wasn't the case. And then because people were sort of accepting me just as I was, finally it got through my wooden skull that I could maybe have a little more room to just be myself. And then it was an incredible of just not having to think that way for a moment. And I realized with this sort of great sadness, kind of how much of my life hasn't been like that, when I saw there was just a tiny little space where I could absolutely be myself in front of other people in a way that was not just tolerated, but actually like celebrated. And then you think, oh wow, I'm 37, and like how many minutes of my life have been spent in that mode.
Part of what the show is as well is that it lives in opera and theater, and also between these two mediums. And we say that it's kind of like its own genre in a way, in the way that it's is queering forms and taking pieces from both forms, but not really living within either of them. And what does that mean to you as someone who's outside of this, spends your life touring, trying to please other people in concerts and in operas? What's it like to create this unique form and find acceptance in this way of storytelling and this way of presenting your voice and your story?
Well, I think that kind of puts the finger on it actually, because I was thinking earlier today, I think some of us are drawn to life situations that reflect back to us the way we feel about ourselves. So I never would have realized this as a young person, but I think that I went into such a harsh and judgmental sort of lifestyle because that sort of reflected where I thought I should be. You know, I should always be judged. And of course, you know, you never think that consciously, but I think something underneath sort of is drawn to the kind of situation that matches up with how your inside feels like it should be. And so it's only been sort of, I guess part of the reason, in addition to being surrounded by beautiful people who were just seeing me as I was, that I was able to sort of have that experience these last couple of weeks. Part of the situation is also that because we've created a new thing that isn't, you know, I'm not singing this thing that people have been singing for 400 years, and there's all this tradition that I have to match up to, which I never will. Because it's a new thing, and you know, it's only me, it's only my show. No one knows what's going to happen. No one knows the music. There's no right way to do it. I think that's the thing. Is because it's a new thing, there's no right way to do it, which means that I can be myself, and that's a very strange experience for me. Even, you know, I'm sort of a bit sort of you know, sort of neurodivergent light, I always say, and actually I've never said that before this moment, but I'm a bit neurodivergent light, and so there's a lot of traits that I can mask about, you know, the way my body wants to move and the way my brain goes and stuff, that I can sort of, you know, I'm a day walker, like I can sort of go into situations and for a while at least pretend that I'm sort of just neurotypical. And then, and often you have to sort of keep the lid on that the whole week that you're, you know, away in, you know, Kansas City or whatever. And then you sort of let it out, you're like, ugh, you know, like letting your belly out at night or whatever. And with this show, I was realizing in the past couple of weeks how much I could just let my body do what it wanted, because no one was saying, oh, that's not what that character would do, because the character's me. So then it was amazing realizing how much my voice could let out, and also just the things that have always been the things that I don't like about myself that sort of get in the way of me doing a good job in classical music are the things that make this show more rich and more interesting.
One section of your bio talks about what you normally sing, which is like concerts and operettas and operas, Britten, Brahms, messiahs.
Yeah.
What's it like when people who know you from that context, or opera people, come to the show and you know that they're there? How do you cope with that? And what's your acceptance piece around sharing this part of your people with people who know you from this very classical methodology?
Well, the amazing thing actually about the acceptance piece that I never realized before, you hear people talk about this all the time, and maybe it doesn't register until you experience a moment of it, is that if I truly am accepting myself, if the situation and my personal journey and the people around me have given me a space where I could actually do that, then I really don't care. Like, this is the crazy thing, is then if I'm in a space today where I think, oh no, the situation allows you to sort of accept all the things about yourself that you don't like, and to actually celebrate them and to actually bring them into the room as content, not just as sort of you know, sort of parasitic movements or whatever. If that's all true, then I kind of think, oh well, I hope those opera people are you know, buckled in for the ride they're about to get, because if I believe in it, and this is something that I didn't understand until recently, that you could actually sort of in a fundamental way not care about what people think. Like, I mean, you sort of, you know, I'm interested to hear it, but like if I think I only care about what people think if I need them to sort of get me above a certain level of approval. Like if I need them to get me to a baseline of approval because I am not providing that for myself. And people talk about this all the time, like any self-help book, any Brene Brown thing, any Oprah Winfrey thing is always going to talk about how you need to love yourself, you know, RuPaul famously. But it kind of, I think maybe until you have the experience, you don't realize what that actually means. That they're just words, you know, if you can't love yourself, how are you going to love anybody else, you know? But it's sometimes it's not until you actually experience that, and like I said, like that you realize, wow, my whole life has been spent living in this modality that I didn't realize there was another option. I thought that's just what life was.
We've been working on this show since 2019. and I have not heard you talk like this until the last 3 weeks.
Yeah, that's good. That's why I'm glad that this is happening after I wrote that blurb about what we were doing this morning.
So what's shifted? Like, what will you take moving forward now that we've done the show in hometown and we've kind of talked about this acceptance piece? Like, how is that going to carry forward into the rest of your classical music career now?
I mean, actually, so just as you were saying that just now, I was remembering actually the seed for this last couple of weeks starting, because I knew this was coming up. This is coming out of end of a very busy time for me when I've just been in this new city every week and doing a bunch of stuff. And I knew this was at the very end of that. And so I've been really like sort of keeping my eye on the prize, because in the past, this has been a very exhausting thing doing this show. Just there's a physical element of it. And of course, there's a sort of spiritual, emotional element. And it's a very demanding show just on a technical level, just physically as a singer and as an actor. And so I was really gearing up for it, and I was in Tampa Bay doing an Elijah the week before. And it's, yeah, I've talked about this before, I don't need to get into it, but it's a kind of a stressful gig because there isn't very much for me to do, but the things that there are for me to do, I really have to be on for the 2 minutes I'm singing, and then I sit there for 2 hours, and I have to be on again for this difficult 2 minutes, and then sit down again. And as a sort of, sort of squirrely kind of person, that's not really how I live. And so I spent so much of that week, getting paid very nicely to be like binding my anxiety to my spine, ooh, because I couldn't do what I was talking about doing in this, was just being kind of like, active and moving and pouring myself into it. I had to really hold myself back in order to pour just like an eyedropper full of myself into the audience for 2 minutes and then sit back and sit still. And it was in that moment, the week before we were doing this, that this kind of opened up for the first time, which is I had this sort of moment of crisis where I called my husband after a bad dress rehearsal, and I was like, why am I even doing this? Like, why am I doing this with my life? Why am I torturing myself doing this thing where no one, like, I'm just a sort of an interchangeable tenor, probably not as good as the next guy. And, it's just like, I'm torturing myself, and for what? Just so that this guy will maybe approve of me today and then maybe not tomorrow when I'm not as good. And because of having that moment of just being like, no, I don't want to live like this anymore. Like, this isn't what I want to do with my life. This isn't how I want to spend my limited life resources. That sort of, sort of crisis moment. The next day I was like, okay, you know what? I got to do whatever it takes for me to actually just be able to sort of live through this moment, and not just get through, but actually like live through this, because my life is happening here. And if this is how I'm spending my life resources, I at least want it to be something that's worth it, even if it, not beyond just like trading my sort of lifeblood for cash. And so I was sitting there on stage in the first show of the Elijah the next night, and I was like, you know what? The only way that I'm ever going to be able to do the thing that I want to do here is if I let my body just kind of do this a little bit. Like, I'm sitting there on stage in my tuxedo in front of this audience of thousands of people, and I'm just kind of being like this. Like, I'm just kind of like, and maybe not even as much as I'm doing right now, a little, just a little bit sort of like this, sort of like, like my waveform is wiggling a bit. And it was an amazing thing to realize, like, no, it's more important to me in this moment that all these sort of stuffed shirt, bored, rich people see this person acting a little weird, and maybe my face getting a little too dramatic when I'm in the moment, rather than that I sort of keep that sort of opera veneer on and just sit still, and then stand up and don't do very well, and then torture myself for the next week because I'm not good enough, And so it was a real moment of really actually having to face the actual boogeyman of the sort of judgmental opera people that I spent my whole life trying to impress, and be like, no, it's more important to me that I actually like sort of am myself in some containable way that I can live with. And then I was able to, and then because of having that moment in the hard situation, then I was able to bring it into the warm bath of gentle, loving support of Pacific Opera the next week, in a way that I might not have been if I was in the mode of judgment. Because I think if you bring the mode of judgment, you can bring the mode of judgment to the person that loves you the most and think, why are you saying that to me? Why are you being so judgmental to me? Why are you picking at me? And they're saying, no, I just want to love you. But if you're not bringing that, if you're bringing that I in of like, everyone's judging me, everyone's picking at me, then even in the most loving situation, you can't take advantage of it. So I think that's the beginning.
This show is all your own music. And we've talked about this where you have, now it's all your own music and also your own orchestration as well. How have you approached this music differently, knowing that as the composer, you can accept whatever the singer does, that you have permission basically to modify or to change expectations in the moment for audience?
Well, that's actually a very tricky thing because, well, actually, in a recent review, it was a very nice review, but the reviewer said it's interesting because Isaiah Bell, the composer, is not very nice to Isaiah Bell, the tenor. That's actually the friction between those two things is kind of a thing that's the piece of the show. In fact, there's a moment of the show where I talk about sort of like a cannabis haze where you feel like the shortcut to accepting yourself because you see, oh, everything's okay, like everything's okay just as it is, and then of course an hour later you've lost it. But that's the moment in the show where I'm the least accepting of what's actually happening with my voice, where I've written this very beautiful, expansive thing, and then if my voice can't execute it on a particular night, I'll be like, oh, you idiot, like you broke it big. And so, but I think there's this crazy thing with singing, and I don't need to get into the technique of it, but I always say that in some ways I'm so glad that I got into this incredibly difficult life because I would never get into any of this stuff. We wouldn't be having this conversation if I hadn't done the hardest possible thing for my body, which is being in a place where your body has to be totally naturally, your whole body has to be like sort of naturally vibrant and alive and in control at the same time in a situation where you're the least likely to want to be vulnerable, which is in front of a bunch of people who are judging you and paying you money. And so it's only because of that clash that I've actually had to face a lot of this stuff and come up with these experiences that then make me understand it, hopefully make me able to share with other people. And so in this show, not feeling like I could accept the way that things were, because even though I wrote it for myself, I mean, you've said, well, you could change it if you didn't like it. If it's too hard, you could just rewrite it. I'm like, no, that's the way the piece is. It has to be like that. But there's this quality of this is the other thing I wanted to kind of say about acceptance in general that I've learned from singing, is that if you live your whole life, if I've lived my whole life, naturally my default mode is that the thing that my body is doing sort of without my interference, that it's just doing on its own, and I can sort of zoom out in a meditational way and observe this sometimes, it's naturally just shutting me down. Like that's the masking piece of being sort of neurodivergent light and being able to mask. Some neurodivergent people don't have that capacity, but if you're able to mask, and of course you're like, no, of course I want to be normal. Of course I don't want anyone to see me as being a little weird, especially if you come from, a totally different sort of culture within our culture. And so my whole body is like, there's this thing of my body like shutting me down all the time. The singing mechanism sort of being locked, all my muscles being sort of, I could be in the barber chair and realize I'm making a fist, or like just my whole body's just all the time. And if that's your default, which I think many people who feel that they're not okay, that is their default in some way, whether it's physically or whether your mind's doing a sort of mental version of that, the action of accepting and letting go and releasing is an action, not a sense of relaxing. And that's what I never understood about. And I think that the singing body is such a metaphor for all our mental processes around this stuff. So if I'm feeling like, I'm so tense, I just need to relax, I've spent years with people telling me, oh, you're so tense, like just relax your body, like if you relax a bit, it'll let it out. But if I relax into more tension because my body's natural state is to be on. And so there's this crazy thing that I've been realizing only recently, where there's all this energy that goes into acceptance, and acceptance is actually a real physical sort of onness if non-acceptance is your default. So it's a beautiful onness. It's this kind of sort of like a sunlight energy. It's not like a sort of working out, running up that hill kind of energy. Yeah, can't sing that for legal reasons, but it's like so there's this crazy thing that I think maybe we miss when we talk about acceptance. And I only realize because singing is a physical version of this. I have to physically accept myself if I'm going to sing well. I have to, in that moment at least, even if I can sort of in a big way. But yeah, so it's an amazing thing that I could talk about for hours, but I won't because we've already gone over time. But there's this sense of pouring energy into acceptance and opening yourself in an active way. In like opening yourself isn't just like I'm just gonna like sort of splay out in the sunlight. It's like actually opening yourself with your hand. The famous metaphor of like if your hand has been locked in a fist your whole life, undoing the fist is not just relaxing. Undoing the fist is getting all the energy and all the strength and all the sort of life force in your body to like, and then you're like, wow, that's amazing. And then maybe you can relax after. But yeah.
I'm going to ask one more question before we open up to question. And that is something we haven't talked about much yet, which is when we started doing the show, working on the show, you were a bit hesitant to use the term queer artist. And Eyes of Noble, but we're making a piece of queer theater here. And now you've come around to using the word queer artist. How have you accepted that term? And what's been the process around that piece of the show's identity and your own identity as an artist?
Yeah, it's interesting because I guess my hesitation was that it's not, and we say this in the show, it's, the show has queer stories of queer love and lust and etc. But it's not, in my mind, it's about this stuff we're talking about. It's about the acceptance and non-acceptance piece. And it's not about being queer. So that's why I was hesitant to talk about it as a piece of queer theater, because but I think that also snuck underneath that in the sort of omnibus bill of that opinion is this feeling that, like, as someone who, like, when I was coming out and coming into myself in the early 2000s, I always say that it was the time in history, I think, when it was the most okay to be queer in this particular way, where as long as you were like a sort of normal queer, or if you were like totally outrageous, like that, but that had been happening for a while, where you could be like, and so growing up in a small town, I had this I was really in this awkward place, and I think a lot of people of our particular age group felt this, where they're like, oh no, I have no issues with being queer. It's totally cool now. There's a gay.com, all this stuff, but only in this very particular niche, where you're sort of quote straight acting, which is almost hate speech now. I mean, but like this very sort of like passing kind of thing. And that's kind of what, for me, that melted right into trying to come off the farm, off the commune, and just sort of be normal in society, trying to be neurodivergent light and just be normal in society. And that's a very damaging thing for a lot of people who are sort of just on the edge of being able to come off as normal, and if you're like a tall white guy, I think you can sort of, you can sort of go into a coffee shop and have everyone think, look, there it is, a regular person, just like the default person, which is our society's sort of toxic thing, is that, there are people who just like sort of can tell themselves that they have the default opinion, that they have the sort of default experience, and everyone else has the sort of, the experience with a little bit of extra sort of zhuzh on it, And so I think that I fell into that without knowing, and even up until when we were talking about this, just thinking, oh no, I'm a reasonable guy, I'm a sort of a normal person. And then it wasn't until we started digging into the show and deconstructing that I realized that I even had that thing, and so I think, yeah, I think it's, and now my experience with it, we were talking about this on a podcast recently, but I think my experience with the queer label, part of embracing it, and this is kind of ties into what I was saying about embracing, like the singing motivation of embracing thing, where you sort of blossom into something in an active way, as opposed to letting go and relaxing into it, is that I've started to see the label of being queer, especially in contrast to gay, which means a particular thing, is a sense of queerness, almost as a sense of the way that you the way that you live in the world, being sort of next to or at an angle to the sort of mainstream mode kind. And I think that so many people who identify as queer now, I think sexuality and sexual orientation and gender orientation is kind of the entry point into that. But I think that if we look at our community as a queer community, you can see that that's so much the definition of people. For instance, people who define themselves as queer versus gay, which is a different kind of mode now. And this is, I don't want to get into the weeds with this, and I don't want to get angry emails, but it's I think that's something that as I've embraced that sort of label and accepted that there are labels that apply to me, because as someone who can convince themselves that they're the default mode, I saw a thing on the internet this morning where the number one way to piss off a man is by being like, you're a real boy boss. And you sort of gendering something that used to be like your version is the non-gendered version, and then other people get the gendered version, which is like the sort of, the version with a little extra color on it,
I think part of it too is how you're playing with genre too, like you're kind of queering art forms as well as like that. I think that's part of what hopefully the artist path is for you forward too, is that how are you mixing these art forms together to make something new?
Yeah, and I think the identity of being of realizing that if there's a label put onto you, it's maybe it applies to both the part of you that doesn't fit into society, and the part that also is your difference, like is your sort of light, is your unusualness. And I think that living in a life where you're trying to keep yourself beige is and just sort of camouflage into the world is fundamentally sort of, in the Christian terminology, which is implanted in me forever, sort of putting your light under a bushel, like sort of ironically, like just kind of keeping the part of you that's different and the part of you that's sort of your own specific thing, sort of normal in quotes. And I think that's, now that I'm aware of this and having experience, like I said, with having experienced the moment of acceptance and then realizing how much of your life you haven't been accepting things, now that I've understood how much I've been sort of keeping myself in a sort of heteronormative box and being like sort of quote straight acting, all that kind of thing. I realize how much the sort of tragedy of keeping your actual artist in a, you know, and I think we all have a sort of creative person in us that's our distinctive thing, and it's not about being, oh, you know, every one of us is a unique sunflower, but like just like there is a part of you that's you. And it doesn't, other people don't have to see, oh, she's so strange and quirky, she's so interesting. It's just, it doesn't even have to be that specific. It's just there's a part of you that is only you. And the crazy thing about it, and this is the last thing I'll say, the crazy thing about this for me is because I've always been kind of a quirky person. I've always been tall and redheaded. I've always had weird ideas, never, even despite my best efforts, never quite been able to be normal. And I think everyone who knows me knows that, even back when I was trying to act more normal than I am now. But the crazy thing about finding the moment of the quirkiness isn't that it's not quirkiness maybe isn't the right word, but isn't that it's a moment of like, there, I discovered it. Wow, this is the thing that makes me unique. It's this crazy moment of seeing, oh no, this is the air I've been breathing my whole life. I just didn't realize that was the thing, that was me. You know, like it's, I guess, well, I mean, my friend told me this stupid, it's not a joke, but you know, whatever, I don't even know what you call this, but you know, the two fish who are swimming along and this old fish swims by and he goes, morning boys, how's the water? And the one fish looks at the other fish and goes, what the hell is water? So it's that, but it's thank you. Thank you very much, I'm here all morning. But it's the feeling that I think sometimes the thing that is special about you, the thing that is the thing that you didn't even realize was a thing, is the thing that is so true to you that you exist in it every moment. And it's not about like sort of whacking your way through the weeds to find the beautiful glowing heart of what's special about you. It's about having the courage and the sort of life force to realize that you don't have to find it. You know, that it's always there, and it's whacking away the idea of going to find it. That is.
I think at this point we should open it up to questions, either from the lovely folks in the room or from the lovely folks online. Yes.
Thank you. That was such a great talk, and I learned so much. Thanks for sharing that. Especially, I really like your talking about how acceptance is an action. It's an action rather than a passive. When you were talking about the role of composer in tenor, I was wondering if now that you've lived the performance and gone through the motions of that and put yourself into this new position, do you think there'd be a path forward where you would give the story to another performer to act, and do you think there'd be a different learning with distance or with seeing it from a more maybe objective mode?
Yeah.
Not exactly, but kind of just being somewhat distant from it. Would that bring something new to that role? Or?
Yeah, okay, that's really, so in case, I don't know if this
Yeah,
registers on
repeat
the,
it
yeah,
quickly.
so you're asking, like now that the piece is sort of up on its own, can I imagine like giving it over to someone else, and then with giving it over to someone else, like giving a distance that would give more perspective to the piece, which is totally, I mean, so someone asked me this question the other day, and this is kind of two questions, because the thing about seeing your own work from another perspective is for me everything. Like even in terms of sometimes just surprising yourself when you're in a different brain space coming at the thing you're doing. And you know, that, I mean, that's a famous creative tool if anyone's reading Rick Rubin or anything. But you know, sort of, yeah, like hearing it from, or even sometimes even hearing someone describe the thing that you're doing can give you, you're like, oh, I didn't even realize that's what that was. Or when we were doing this, I was working with a consultant about how we're going to sort of market our show, and after I was thinking about how she was talking about it, I went and wrote down how I would imagine my sort of dream review, you know. So like, what would I imagine someone saying? And then when I wrote that down, I was like, oh, that's actually how we can market the show. It's like that's just what it is, because I know the show best, and that is what it is. But I couldn't trust myself to actually be strong enough to say like this is what the show is because someone else has to say it. But then I realized, oh no, you can just say that that's just what the show is. But anyway, so that's so But in terms of whether, in terms of giving it over to someone else, I mean, part of the show is that it's so specific to my experiences. And so when someone asked me this the other day, I thought the only way that I could imagine giving it over to someone else is if they weren't pretending to be me. Like if it was adapted, because I think the thing about the show being adaptable and being something that's very plastic is that it can always change for the situation that we're in. So if we're in a new environment, we sort of change the way that works a little bit. We sort of massage the text. And now more and more, now that I'm more comfortable with it, we just done 19 performances of it. This is our 19th performance. Now I can actually respond to the way the audience is responding to something. So I'll move something ahead if people aren't picking up the jokes, or if they're laughing, there'll be more time. Or I'm saying lines ad-libbing lines that are sort of responding to the way people are laughing in the room, or if there's a particular sort of call out or whatever. So with that in mind, I think that if someone else was to do it, I think they would have to acknowledge that they're not me, and the process of them telling the story of someone who isn't them, I think would have to be in the very marrow of the thing that they were doing. For me, this is a larger conversation, but I think that's kind of an essential thing about the art that we make as sort of creative artists versus the arts that we interpret as like interpretive artists. Not that there isn't creativity in interpretation, of course, there's so much, but in classical music and in also classic theater, like Shakespeare or whatever, I think there's this whole thing of like, oh, this isn't me, I'm just like, I'm just trying to reproduce what was before. That can be one mode of doing it, like especially in opera and in classical music, where there's all these traditions, the way people have done it for hundreds of years. And for me, I think that can be a bit stultifying and a bit deadening. And so if this show, I would just be so sad if after I died or whatever, I'm still got the license on the show for a while, or if someone else took this and I saw them trying to do what I was doing, I would be very deadened by that.
But I think that there is this push now for this like creator performer to publish scripts and there are prompts in it that people can take the form of the show. Like there's a show called Winners and Losers that was Marcus and Jamie from Vancouver,
right.
James Long and Marcus Youssef. And it was about them and their identities clashing together. And then they published it and said, okay, well, here's how you put your own selves into this show. And I could see that maybe happening.
Yes, I could too. I just think that in a larger scale, in terms of how to do that, I would just think, coming back to the theme of acceptance, like I think that for me, what I've realized through this, like, and I am realizing more and more, I'm not at the end of the journey, on this sort of bumpy, sort of creative road of figuring out who you are and how that can go into your work without sort of making the work all about you, especially when it's not about you. Like, but how do you bring your life force into it in a way that enlivens other people? And for me, a big part of that is accepting everything about the situation, specifically and most importantly, the box that you're living in that you don't realize you're living. So if you're sort of seeing, I'm so interested now in classical things that acknowledge the classical box. So when we walk into the Royal Theatre to see an opera, there's so many assumptions that we're making before the curtain goes up, and that really filters how we see the art. And so that's what when there was the Così POV last, I don't know if anyone's seen it, but the concept was that they were recording this famous opera. So the setup was a recording booth for this opera. And so instantly I was like, okay, something interesting is going to happen, because they're acknowledging that this is a very problematic, very misogynistic piece that has some of the world's most beautiful music in it. And how are you going to do that? Like, can we do the Taming of the Shrew anymore unless the essential thing that's happening is that we are seeing the box that we're doing. So I think that's how I would want to approach it if it was ever to happen. And I think and then it becomes very interesting. See, like famously, I, Tonya, that movie with Tonya Harding a couple of years ago. I love that the whole thing was about how we don't know what happens, and how, number one, how we don't know really what happened, and it's all just people's stories. And number two, that we already know the story. So everyone who's talking to you in the movie, talking to the camera, is like, well, and they're sort of, alluding to the fact that we already know about it. And I would be so bored to watch a movie about Tonya Harding that pretended that we didn't know the story,
We probably have time for another question, and I don't know how to check if there's one online. Perhaps we can have some assistance. I see no chats.
No
but perhaps
chats.
There are no questions.
Yeah.
I'll keep the conversation.
Sure.
So Sean, thank you so much for setting up all those
very thoughtful questions for Isaiah, and I'm hoping we can maybe flip and highlight you for a second. And the same questions you had for Isaiah around how he may have been trepidatious about the audience's perception of this new word. And you come to this conversation with quite a long history of Greek theater, cabaret, and drag, and how you come to that locally and beyond. So I wonder if you had any trepidation about your core audience following you in the Pacific Opera, thinking, oh God, what is Sean doing with this tenor?
Well, I love that you think that I have a core audience.
I have a core audience.
Thank you. That's a great question. I have not thought about that. I think there probably are some people who would say, "Oh, what are you doing making opera now?" Because they don't know what they don't know what opera can be. I think, and this is a conversation we've had a lot. Is what can opera become? What can theater become, and what happens when you're creating within but also outside the boundaries of these things? And I think that's actually what's the most interesting piece to me about a lot of new work that's happening, but I think especially about this show, is we've really kind of blurred the line between all of these things. And I think that hopefully people will come on that journey and trust. Hopefully people trust the artist, that they say, oh, well, I'll try something new with this person. I think that's a big piece about new work. But I think what's really exciting is that we are kind of giving a big middle finger to every genre that we're playing with, I think, in a way. The show's not theater, and it's not opera, and it's not really storytelling. It's kind of in and around, weaves in and out of all of those things. And cabaret, I'd say it's more cabaret, but it's not set up as vignettes or moments that are linked by music. It's so beautifully nuanced with Isaiah's compositions and stories that I think hopefully people trust enough to get in the room and then go on this journey. And we've had conversations after a lot with people who kind of say, oh, well, I didn't really know what I was getting into. I came here because I know you or know both of you, and I'm really moved by what I saw, or I had expectations of what a solo opera would be, and this wasn't that. So I'm really excited about those conversations and people who think that.
Thanks.
I think another piece that we didn't talk about too is the show's toured to five cities, I think, across Canada since we started it. And part of what we've done is we've gone to big cities and also to small cities. And I think that that's actually really important. I think that touring to smaller cities is really important for queer artists, and I think for this show specifically. And we've been warned by a presenter that they're expecting walkouts, and there weren't any. And we've been in small cities where they said we normally invite donors to the dress rehearsal, but for this show, we're actually going to invite this queer youth group because we think these are the people who need to see the show. And I think that there are so many exciting opportunities around the acceptance that people have when they want to embrace this show, but also when people who think that this show isn't for them see it and see that it's universal, and that there's more as the human experience, not to get too heady, but there's more that we have more in common than differences. And I think that that's a really important piece of this show, and about making queer art and sharing queer art, is that I hope that we're sharing it with people who identify with some part of it, and that doesn't necessarily have to be the queer experience or the queer expression. It can be the human experience. It can be maybe they connect with the music, maybe they connect with the stories of growing up in a very conservative way and then kind of finding this light within them and letting that shine after. And I think there are so many pieces about acceptance, about taking this show to people who don't get experiences with this kind of art and with this kind of work, that is so impactful and important.
Yeah, the idea of the queer label that we were talking about recently, I think I think that in the history of sort of humanity, the way that we discover new things about experience and about life is when something doesn't go the way that you expect it to. I mean, famously, so many things that are inventions that are the result of accidents and discoveries that are the result of something not going the way that it's supposed to. And I think as artists, often it's the people who are sort of misaligned to the sort of normal, I keep using this word, but you know, this word, you know, is when things in my life go the way that I expect them to go and the way that I planned them to go, and the more sort of heteronormative my life is in terms of everything being lined up and the world feeling like it's made for the way that I live my life, that's not where my art comes from. And so when we talk about queer art, I think that the thing for me now I'm interested in aligning myself and ourselves, I think, with this more and more, is that the piece of us that is queer in almost like the classic sense of being misaligned to the sort of mainstream of the world is the piece that I think when you talk about universal experience, even when you say, okay, maybe, you know, this person, it doesn't define themselves as queer, I think one of the reasons that it's so important to get sort of the queer viewpoint out there is that every one of us can connect to the part of us, to the part of yourself that doesn't align with the way that other people around you seem to be. And I think that's one of the great values of queer art, in addition to the things that we all know and talk about more, which is, you know, lifting up people who are caught in a place where they can't accept themselves, and that more sort of famous benefits of queer.
Well, and if someone who's a traditional opera goer can come to this show and see something in it that appeals to them, that they can relate to, hopefully they take that with them on the rest of their journey in the world. And that maybe that changes how they see things a little bit, or how they move through the world, or when they interact with other folks from the LGBTQI+ community. That I think about this all the time when I sit in the booth and I look out and I'm like, okay, there's some 80-year-old women here tonight. What are they going to take away with them? And then we have great conversations with them.
And then they come up afterwards and they say, you know, I've always just been a straight lady, but that totally spoke to me about my thing. And that's kind of, that's the hope every time. Sometimes when I think, you know, should I, you know, bother continuing to do this and to continue to truck this stuff out? And then you have conversations with people who specifically say the specific words of, that isn't my experience, but that spoke to me, and it made me feel my life and think about my life in a different way. And that's because I don't need to, at a certain point, like, I like talking about myself, as we've all witnessed, but I don't need to, at a certain point, go on about myself as a job, unless I feel that my sort of digging into my own experience can have some meaning beyond my own experience. Because I get very sad when I make a discovery and I tell someone else about it, and they think, oh, how nice for you. I'm glad that you're working on yourself, you know? And I think that's not the point of telling you. I mean, I said this, well, I'll end with this maybe, but there was this New Yorker cartoon that I saw actually right after the show. I sent it to my brother, who's very similar brain to me, where this guy is in therapy and it's just, there's no text in the cartoon, it's just speech bubbles, but the therapist speaks this speech bubble that has a triangle in it, and you see that the guy has a triangle-shaped hole in his chest. And so he's like, oh my God. And so then in the next picture, he has this armload of triangles and he's throwing them out to everyone. And this person's got a circle and this person's got a star and this person's got a square. And he's like, look, triangles will fix everyone, you know? And everyone's like, okay, that's nice for you. And I hope that the whole point of this experience, we hope, and we say this in the show, we say, you know, I'm not talking about me to talk about me. I'm talking about me because I'm trying to talk about us. It's just that I'm the piece of us that I know the best. And we do hope, I think both of us, that's our hope with this is, and also in doing a queer show, it's not just for ourselves and it's not just for other queer people. Hopefully it's something that our experience, the more friction you have against the world, the more you learn about the world necessarily. And hopefully that friction brings richness back into the world and doesn't just feed us.
Great, well, I think that's probably all the time, unless there are other questions. No chats. Okay, great. I'm just gonna come in.
Yeah,
Better at last. Okay, thank you, Isaiah and Sean. That was so lovely, and we really appreciate everything you prepared for today. Thank you, and thank you Pacific Opera for hosting. This was fantastic. We really appreciate that, and just say thank you. But the recording of this will be uploaded shortly, so we can spread that around to more audiences. And please join us at the last Friday of June for Alison Big talking on the topic or the theme of reverie. And Allison will be the exhibiting artist of the Victoria Arts Council throughout the summer and showing new, very playful work in sculpture and lithography. So there'll be lots of revelry there. Anyway, thanks again, you two, and good luck with the next iterations of this performance.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us. This was great. Thanks for joining.